So I am going to go ahead and get started. I am Susan Cozzens. I'm physically located right at the moment in the northwest of the US. My institution is the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm a member of the GlobalX Scientific Board. And I'm really delighted to be introducing this fifth workshop in the GlobalX at 20 series that we are using to prepare for the celebration of our 25th anniversary as a global network. We were just celebrating our globalness a few minutes ago. Because this is the first workshop in the series, we have a very slightly different
the oldest TV
format.
show by premiere date was Foxy TV, which premiered on May 14th, 19.
Sorry, this is interesting. I'm hoping that's not going to happen again. The dot just came in. Okay, so our topic this morning is innovation for inclusive development. This is actually something that's been woven into the work of the GlobalX Network from very, very early times, and you'll hear a good bit about that from the speakers and the discussants in our first session, which is really focused on looking back over the last 20 years to see what the GlobalX Network, the GlobalX community, has contributed on this topic. While we've been doing it from the beginning, the topic itself of global inequality, of who's included and not included, has gotten much larger on the world stage. And so we've been prepared for that discussion. And this morning's, today's workshop will really help us explore some of the territory that GlobalX has to contribute both in the past and in the future. We have three segments in what's happening this morning. The first one, which will go for about 75 minutes, is on the debates, issues, and achievements over the last 20 years. We have two main speakers who have 15 minutes each, Judith Sutz from Uruguay and Joe Chataway coming in from the UK, and three discussants, KJ Joseph from one of those continents of India that we just talked about, and Kingiri from Kenya in Africa, and Jeffrey Orozco from Costa Rica. We will then turn to the future, really, to a segment that's oriented to identifying the future challenges in this topic, how innovation can help to bring everybody in. And Smita Srinivas will be the main speaker there, but Thomas Woodson, who's facilitating that, will introduce. And then the last segment is on the policy challenges. What actions can governments and non-governmental organizations actually take to facilitate inclusive development through innovation, rather than innovation that separates us? And we're going to have speakers all the way from the perspective of international organizations to national organizations in that third segment. And then our special feature for this fifth and final workshop is that Erica Kramer-Ambula, the current president of GlobalX, will have some time at the end of the agenda to give us closing remarks for the whole series, all of which is a run-up to the 20th anniversary celebration in Kerala in October. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Judith. Judith Sutz from the Universidad de la República in Uruguay. There are many people here who have been working this topic from the very earliest stages of GlobalX and even before GlobalX was formed, and Judith is certainly one of those. Judith, you have 15 minutes. Could you please give us your thoughts on GlobalX achievements in this area?
Thank you very, very much, Susan. Thank you, everybody. Let me see if I can share. Would you please, Susan, allow me to share my screen?
I should be able to do that.
I think, Susan, you might want to make her co-host.
Okay,
that way-
that's the easy way to do it. That also, I think I just flipped something that should allow you to do it now, Judith.
Okay, let me
Thank you,
see.
Machiko. Yes, no?
For the moment being, I am not seeing I see you, but I don't see oh, that's always happening. Share, let's see what I'm going to share now.
We're getting it now.
But I am not seeing anything. What? Let's see.
Okay, what we are seeing is your
Okay.
Zoom screen.
Okay.
There we go. There's your slides. We're good.
Okay. Now it's okay? Good.
Yes, it's beautiful. Thank you.
Excellent. Then I am just trying to move this if I can. Okay. So
Just one word to the participants. Please put your questions into the chat as we go along. We'll collect them and we'll do questions and answers after all the presentations. Judith, please go ahead.
okay. So we are here in the 5th workshop on innovation for inclusive development, and our first section is on debates, issues, and achievement over the last 20 years. As a forward, innovation can be a good thing, but not always for all. Everett Rogers, the great scholar on innovation diffusion, said that when a system structure is already very unequal, it is likely that when an innovation is introduced, especially if it is a relatively high-cost innovation, the consequences will lead to even greater inequality. So we, innovation scholars, many of us and all of us worried about very unequal societies, should be very aware of that fact. The fight against inequality and for social inclusion through innovation is quite a complicated challenge everywhere, and particularly so in underdevelopment. GlobalX put on the table since its beginning critical thinking on the issue of innovation, inclusiveness, and development, and we will try to highlight some debate issues and achievement around this over the last 20 years, as we were asked to. So let's start by GlobalX prehistory. To worry about inclusive development implies, first of all, recognizing that its lack exists, and it's not just a fact of nature, something inevitable, but a social evil. How were innovation, social justice, and inequality related and jointly conceptualized by those who prepared the intellectual field for the national system of innovation approach? Well, in 1992, the Aalborg School of National System of Innovation and its emphasis on learning, a main GlobalX trait, stressed the importance of building the social condition for learning to flourish, among them, in the first place, trust, supported by social fairness. This is a quote that I love particularly. Social justice is not just a good thing in itself. It might be one of the most important long-term prerequisites for a strong, innovative capability in society. In 1982, GlobalX prehistory, Christopher Freeman pointed to inequality at the global level as a major challenge. It is on a global scale that the most extreme effects of worldwide inequality in incomes are apparent. The bias in the world research innovation system is so great as to constitute a danger for the future of human society. The bias expresses itself in that very little of the world R&D is in fact directly concerned with the elementary needs of the majority of the world's inhabitants. I would like to know what you think about the actuality of this quotation. Christopher Freeman rejected technological determinism, in particular the constant reiteration of the stop reply. You can stop technical progress anyway. As a result, he said, the social mechanism by which to monitor and control the direction and pace of technical change are one of the most critical problems of contemporary politics, even beside R&D and science, technology, and innovation. How was the reflection on these issues at that time in countries of the South? Let's just see a glimpse from Latin America. Fernando Feinsilber was a Chilean economist working at the Economic Commission of Latin America. He wrote in 1990 a very influential text, Latin American Industrialization from the Black Box to the Empty Cell. What became known since then as the empty cell of Latin American development was depicted in this way and explained in terms of the extreme weakness of well-designed knowledge capacity building and innovative efforts. You have high inequality, low inequality, high growth, low growth. In high growth, high inequality, some Latin American countries, Brazil particularly. In low growth and high inequality, you have a lot of Latin American countries at that time: Bolivia, Peru, Paraguay, Central America. In low growth and low inequality, at that time, only two countries, Uruguay and Argentina. And then you have the empty cell of Latin American development, high growth and low inequality. And Feinsilber explained that this persistent structural situation in our continent, that is the more unequal of all, was due to lack of attention of the issue of knowledge in production. It seems that people around the world in this global prehistory were linking inequality with innovation, learning, and competence building, signaling as well that social justice is not just a hopeful consequence of innovation, but a prerequisite of it. Let's see now the second point, GlobalX's contribution over 20 years on innovation for inclusive development. We have several indicators. For instance, the very first GlobalX thematic report, 2012, was on learning, innovation, and inclusive development. And in that report, it was told that among 500 papers accepted in the GlobalX conference of 2010 in Kuala Lumpur and 2011 in Buenos Aires, 20% and 15% of papers respectively dealt with inclusive development, and 2/3 of them had it as the central theme. So inclusive development was a main issue for GlobalX community. And the themes of several GlobalX conferences dealt with inclusive development. For example, the 13th GlobalX conference 2015 in La Habana, Cuba, was innovation to reduce poverty and inequality for sustainable and inclusive development. The whole conference was under this flag. More indicators. In the first number of the Innovation and Development Journal, 2011, dedicated to the memory of Chris Freeman, Chris' chosen text was Technology, Inequality, and Economic Growth. And several contributions from GlobalX member in books and papers have dealt with inclusive development. This is from Erika. This is from Smita. She has a wonderful chapter in this book. This is from Latin America, Gabriela Dutrenit and myself, and this is from Susan. I'm sorry. No, I am not sorry. These are all women. More indicators. In 2014, in a LALIC, Latin America LIC workshop in Montevideo, a declaration was issued on contribution from science, technology, innovation to social inclusion. And it is the link. And in the next month, it's not the past, it's also the future. Both Africalis and LALICs are organizing activities that deal with this matter. Technological innovation and economic inequality is an Africa webinar in April, a little bit further from now, and a seminar on new innovation approaches to reach a sustainable and inclusive development. This is LALIC Paraguay in June. And now let's see a second issue of the last 20 years, a major intellectual shift from catching up to inclusive development. Pentoke Lundvall wrote in the abstract of a recent paper, 2022, while it is correct that innovation policy, at least until recently, has given priority to economic growth and low priority to global challenges such as climate change and income inequality, this is no way immanent in the innovation system concept. Totally agree, implying that yes, we have a shift, because now we are giving more priority than ever to these issues. Moreover, I would add that not so high priority was given in innovation studies to Amartya Sen's recommendation to address the issue of equality of what, suggesting that income inequality is one among several others that deserve attention in terms of innovation approaches to social inclusion. Catching up implied thinking in terms of ladders and the places where they lead. Economic growth via industrialization as the ladder, and several indicators, mainly economic, that characterize the highly industrialized countries as the place. Given that the latter countries tend to kick away such ladders, heterodox strategies for catching up need to be devised to succeed. But the fact is that the climate change challenge and diverse and persistent inequality and other evils, like growing authoritarianism and the weakening of democracies, raise reasonable doubts about the existence of a desirable place towards which to catch up by climbing a ladder that could lead the whole Earth to irrecoverable disaster. This has been acknowledged by a third part of the global community, leading to conceptualization of innovation for inclusive development that go beyond the implicit hypothesis of inclusiveness as the trickle-down effect of economic growth. Development is no more catching up, at least it is not identified with catching up. Taking Albert Hirschman's word, when talking on development economics, we can say that innovation for catching up had achieved its considerable luster and excitement through the implicit idea that it could slide the dragon from backwardness virtually by itself, or at least that its contribution to this task was central. We now know that this is not so. A consoling thought is that we have gained in maturity what we have lost in excitement. And GlobalX has indeed, in the 20 years of its existence, gained in maturity, addressing innovation for inclusive development through a wide range of diverse and complementary approaches, from macro strategies to localized intervention, from international point of view to national policies, from changes in whole industry to individual innovation that solve problems of vulnerable population. And perhaps, beside gaining in maturity, we have also gained in excitement. Last, a journal full of encounters. Working on innovation for inclusive development put our community in contact and discussion with other people, from academia, from politics and policies, from community of practice, from social actors. We have learned from them, and I think we have also made substantial contributions to the understanding of a fairly complex set of issues. Working in the National System of Innovation framework, stressing the fundamental importance of learning and capability building, we were able to integrate our other points of view and put forward ours. Through the GlobalX Academy and the tireless work of the regional leagues, plus the GlobalX International Conference, young and not so young people all over the world gathered to present evidence, refine concepts, and discuss with passion how to contribute through innovation to a better world. Freeman said that innovation is a coupling process, and the coupling first takes place in the minds of imaginative people. Inclusive development needs these imaginative people making innovation work for it. This is what GlobalX has been doing during its first 20 years and will continue doing for many more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith, for reminding us of that very long set of thinking and work. So we're going to turn now to Joe Chataway from University College London, who's coming in from the UK. And I will unpin Judith. And Joe, please let us know what help you need, if anything.
Gosh, this is looking
There you go.
unfamiliar. Screen.
Technology intervening.
Technology.
How can we help you, Joe?
Not fine. I sent you the latest version, Susan. Maybe it's just easier if you get them up.
Why don't you start talking and I
Yes,
will look
okay.
for your slides.
Thank you very much. Okay, so my talk is quite different from Judith, but there are many overlaps and many points of kind of convergence, I think, which is interesting. So, you know, the last 20 years have seen some major changes in our field. And in large part, I think, the development of policy approaches has rested, of course, on the remarkable contribution of innovation systems. It's infused the debate and the contribution of scholars, researchers, policymakers enormously. So there's a lot to be said about that. And, you know, in the context of the next 15 minutes, I'm just going to touch on a few themes and a few points that we could perhaps talk about. And of course, within innovation systems thinking, within that framework, Judith has pointed to the ways in which thinking has evolved, in which research has evolved, in which policy thinking has evolved. So, you know, there's the increasing presence of a concern with inequality and inclusive development, which is very evident, regional perspectives, sustainability issues. There's a wide spectrum of work on different aspects of inequality, which have been coming to the forefront in our community in recent years. And recently there have been, as this framework, this well-known graphic now will probably known to all of us, suggest there's been other perspectives which have informed the work. If you could go back, Susan, to the Venn diagram. Yeah, let's start there.
Okay, good.
We can
Got it.
we can go with that. There's been this idea that there are three frames of policy narratives and framework. No, the Venn diagram one. That's it. That perspective emphasizes really, I think, the differences between these three frames. So frame one is R&D and regulation, frame two, national systems of innovation, and frame three, transformative change. And I think, you know, the first is obviously rooted in notions of market failure, the second, systems failure, and the third, need failure. And that's different from demand failure, which has been talked about previously. It calls for a more nuanced and complex understanding of the need between of the need to think about beyond supply and demand what need might be. So it's a more sociological and political science informed approach, perhaps, as well as economic. And Judith emphasized the kind of transition in our thinking, expansion in our thinking from economics to incorporate different disciplinary perspectives. And that article that Judith mentioned by Bao also does that in a really nice way. And this third framework, transformative change, isn't really rooted so much in innovation systems literature. It hasn't been anyway, but in STS literature and transitions and transformative innovation literature. So I think, you know, what this framing does is allow us to see in a schematic way some of the changes which have taken place in our world in terms of the research and policy that's been done and the perspectives on that research and policy. There's much more to be said, but I'll stop there. But I think there are some weaknesses to it. It emphasizes the differences and the linearity too much. There are different layers of policy which operate in a very complex way and interact with each other. And although, you know, in any Venn diagram, there's the overlap, the narrative around this framings document hasn't always emphasized that. It hasn't emphasized that the community of policymakers and researchers are the same in many cases. And people are working together to evolve not only thinking within each of the policy framings, but between the policy framings as well. And it also doesn't reflect the reality that there's often a confusion of intention in policy. So, you know, lots of policy is made by picking up ideas which clearly span the different framings, and that adds a layer of messiness and complexity, which isn't often represented, which isn't always represented. So the reality is that the messiness and the institutions built up around the research that we do, the policy that we inform, doesn't disappear as these new frameworks emerge. It's a complex interaction. Academic career structures, for example, which keep people rooted in different frameworks, don't disappear. Economic growth, which is so deeply embedded in different institutions, and policy ambitions in different ways, and which can root policymakers in different policy framings, don't disappear. Peer review, you know, clearly a frame one institution is still very much with us as an idea of how quality and direction of science should be oriented. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So Susan, if we could go on to the next slide now. So for all of those reasons and the weaknesses, I prefer this kind of graphic, which does depict a changing of the ways in which research is focused and policy development happens, but it emphasizes, I hope, the ways in which there's interaction and change, not only in the different policy framings themselves, but the way that those different policy framings inform each other as well. So it's a constant picture of change. Again, Val's article, which Judith mentioned, talks about how innovation systems thinking has changed and makes that very clear, that it's not a static picture at all, it's a dynamic picture. So the ways in which we now think about scientific excellence has changed dramatically. And Erica Craven-Buller, others have written about that very nicely and looked at that issue. Think about what's happened to missions approaches, for example. It combines all elements of missions approaches, missions policy, combine elements of all three approaches. And so does the notion of inclusive innovation has come into systems of innovation thinking, is a force in science policy oriented towards SDG and policy goals in very interesting ways, which combine different concepts. I think the pandemic illustrates the complexity of the interactions between the three approaches to policy very well, and there's quite a lot we could dwell on there, but in the interest of time, I'll just mention one thing, that the expanding kind of scope and ambition of policy to incorporate different concerns, including inequality and inclusivity, means that we need different data, and that is something that we see very clearly from the pandemic. We need data sets that relate to behaviors, institutions which shape policy and behaviors. Vaccines, for example, relying on the science didn't get us where we wanted to be. So we need to recognize that need for much more complicated data sets in the work that we do, if we are wanting to really incorporate more inclusive approaches, inclusive in all senses, disciplinary and orientation. If we could just move on again, Susan. So I'm just going to mention one other way, which I think our policy and research landscape has evolved and changed. There's much more intense interaction, I think, between policy for science, so that's funding for science, regulation, governments, standards and so on, and science for policy, that's science advice. And we often think of science policy, you know, in those two domains, policy for science, science for policy. But in fact, what we can see here is that there's a whole world which is built up connecting those two domains. And if you like, it's a hive of activity, and we're the pollinators who span thinking about the relationship between policy for science and science for policy, and actually are doing it. We're giving advice in a more intensive way, I would say, and interacting with policymakers in a more intensive way over the last 20 years. So we need to think about that. We need to think about what that means for our field. Over the past decades, we've seen new initiatives, organizations, and infrastructures emerged at assembling, communicating, integrating knowledge. The IPPC, for example, the IPVES, Gavi, PPPs in global health could be considered from that angle. And there are many at national levels, those initiatives which span both funding, governance of science and giving science advice. And the pandemic again saw a sort of explosion of institutions which tried to do that, and that's quite an interesting and complicated thing, I think, for us as Globelics and as innovation scholars, as innovation policy scholars to think about. So just if we move on to the next slide, Susan. Yeah, so what does it mean? So what does these changes mean for our community? Well, I think one thing is that we need to pay attention to this idea of collective intelligence, ways to analyze and coordinate across different policy areas, to think about data that relate to our need to integrate economic policy and social policy in creative ways. And that, I think, puts the focus on methods and transparency of data in really interesting ways. Clearly, we need to fully accept the importance of social context as well as economic context if we're to successfully kind of integrate inclusive innovation perspectives in the work that we do. It's not a domain of neatly kind of delineated economic context. It's much messier, and we need to fully acknowledge that. And I think just one other point, I kind of it's a sort of bugbear of mine, but the need for new approaches to peer review. How on earth can conventional approaches to peer review begin to consider a real examination of the quality of work done, the quality of outputs, if we're using conventional communities of peer reviewers to judge work which spans very different areas and has different intent. So I think, looking forward a bit and preempting perhaps this afternoon's later discussions, those are some of the things we need to think about. Just one final slide. I was a bit hesitant about this, but I wanted to end the talk with some just broad comments on love and science policy. And the idea for a piece I wrote, a very short piece in 2021 on this, came from listening to a conservative politician in the UK, Rory Stewart, who was trying to make his case to lead the Tory party. Unfortunately, didn't win that, and we ended up with the charlatan that we got in the form of Boris Johnson. But Rory Stewart, to the Tory party, to the Conservative Party, a very kind of stiff upper lip British institution, talks a lot about love in his campaign. And in response to someone in the audience who asked him about what he was going to do for her as a transgender person, he said it's about pride in each other, it's about listening, and I'm afraid it's about love. And it made me think a lot, and I went back to some of the literature, social policy literature and social theory literature, which of course is full of actually a commentary on love. I won't talk about that at all, but it did in the context of this talk. We've already said there are people on this call for whom it is, not yet 4 a.m. in the morning, and there are others who are up late at night. And this community is driven by strong emotions. It's driven by a desire to engage, to interact with each other, to make the world a better place. And it's held together by bonds and networks. And that is an enormous strength of Globelics, and something to be just so proud about. And, you know, we live in an increasingly polarized world. Our times are changing. We need to be alert to the dangers of polarization, because, you know, love can often be countered, of course, by equally powerful hate forces. And I think we just need to dwell a little more on how we interact as a community and how we strengthen the positive aspects of all the positive aspects of our interaction, to really highlight the fact that there's an enormous amount of care and compassion in the community. One other thing I think it does is throw back a light on the importance of how we think about rigor and quality, because how we judge contributions in a supportive way, in a constructive way, has to do a lot with that, actually, how we think about quality, how we judge quality, how we judge contributions. So I'm going to leave it there with a note of love. Thank you all.
Oh, thank you, Joe, very much. Let me get the screen share off so that I can see people a little better. Thank you very much for that last slide, which really carries through on what Judith was saying as well, that there's a commitment in the way this community has been built, as well as the way we are thinking about our place in the world, and in the equality or inequality that's being created in the world. And that is a tribute to our founders, some of whom are certainly here on this seminar, and also to the whole community. So thank you for reminding us of those central commitments. We can turn now to three discussants coming from three kind of different perspectives, but people who've been involved in thinking through this set of very complex issues, as Joe just laid them out for quite a while. We've been joined now by KJ Joseph from the Gulati Institute of Finance and Trade in Kerala, a former Secretary General and actually the current Secretary General of GlobalX and one of our founding members. So KJ, you have 8 to 10 minutes to provide some discussion of the two presentations and your own perspectives on GlobalX achievements in this area. You want to unmute and you should be able to share.
Yeah, Susan,
if you want to do that.
Susan, thank you. First of all, I must apologize because I decided to come to my office on a holiday to join for the meeting. Then there was some power problem, so I could not get connected. I'm sorry about it. But I have the opportunity to share the thoughts that Judith and Joanna shared over the email. And first of all, I must congratulate Susan and the team for making this great effort, providing an opportunity after 20 years for ourselves to sit back, relax, take pride in, and at the same time be self-critical so that we can think through our way forward. So thank you very much, and thank you for being one of the discussants. And I must say that in a sense, we are all birds with the same feathers. So there may not be much difference in our thought process because we normally learn by interacting among ourselves. So my learning on the issue at hand of inclusive innovation for inclusive development essentially is drawn from our GlobalX community. This reminds me, as Judith has shared in her note earlier, the context in which I know that I cannot keep on talking for long. The context in which GlobalX was established, it was basically a period almost after 20 years of neoliberal reforms, wherein the policy pendulum in the developing world shifted from inward-oriented state-centric, plan-based development strategy to one that is driven by market in an open regime. Of course, I remember Bendoke quoted in one of his papers of Arthur Lewis giving the warning in his Nobel lecture, saying that the true engine of growth shall not be trade, but it should be technology, and those who are resorting to trade is doomed to frustration. And in 1983, in one of the much prominent papers of Amartya Sen in Economic Journal Development, which were now by comparing the development experience of of Sri Lanka, China, and Kerala, he has made a warning, or rather an alert to the policy makers in the developing world who were very much impressed by the South Korean development, saying that if you see it as a free market, then you can see Walras's auctioneer going around with the white paper in the one hand and whip on the other. He was reiterating the role of market. And later we have seen we see Danny Rodriguez says, while a bad policy regime can make a country poor, but a good trade policy per se cannot make a poor country rich. Underlying the need for what GlobalX community would say, the need for learning, innovation, and competence building systems. And again, in 2001, Joseph Stiglitz said, globalization is neither good nor bad. Those who have embraced globalization at their terms and at their own pace, there was enormous benefit, but for others, it was an unmitigated disaster. And that unmitigated disaster, and why that has given rise to, is actually a major question that GlobalX community has enormously contributed. I would say all the participants in this workshop have contributed in one way or other towards our understanding. And the medium of that was essentially our journal, Innovation and Development. I remember when we mooted the idea of a GlobalX journal, Bendoke said, no, it should not be a GlobalX journal. It is good for the journal and for the GlobalX to be separate. And he suggested the name, Innovation and Development. And in the opening issue itself, we had the painful experience of publishing obituary of our beloved Chris Freeman. In that opening article of the journal, he unequivocally argued how inequality has increased under globalization. And in the same issue, we have article by Bendoke saying the relevance, articulating the relevance of building learning, innovation, and competence building systems. And again, Dick Nelson making the relevance of evolutionary thoughts instead of what is called the neoclassical thought process. Subsequently, innovation and development, my thought process will be much more based on what innovation and development, that is the platform that GlobalX community published its thoughts, our research. We had a number of special issues. So for example, starting with the second issue itself, Fernando Santiago, who is going to be one of the speakers, talking about innovation for inclusive development, drawing from our support of the networked research on innovation for inclusive development supported by IDRC. And we had a specific project on inclusion for inclusive development by taking the experience of two large economies of India and China. And subsequently, we had special issues on innovation in the bioeconomy. And incidentally also, along with inclusion, we have also innovation and development has articulated the sustainability issue in a more profound way than others when Tillman articulated the concept of sustainability-oriented innovation system. Later, a special issue by Rasmus on low carbon innovation. And coming back to, again, inclusion for inclusive development, we have a special issue by Glenda and her colleagues, particularly articulating the fact that the issue of poverty, issue of exclusion is primarily rural and agrarian, and she was been articulating the role of a state for inclusive innovation for inclusive rural transformation and innovation in the bioeconomy. And John Biden and others argued the same question, the issue, and the natural resource-based development by Anderson. So what I'm trying to argue is that there is hardly any journal, any community that has as articulated profoundly the issue of innovation for inclusive development and building on to the concept of basically building the underlying the role for building innovation systems in the South. Now, today, when you are talking about this, after almost 40 neoliberal years of reform, there is a general consensus that globalization is at the crossroads. And as early as in 2005, Danny Rodriguez said, Washington consensus has given away to Washington confusion. And today, after the post-COVID, I don't want to say post-COVID, the COVID, we are in fact in India, COVID is again coming up, it looks like. So at the current juncture, in the context of globalization and the context of COVID, how we have the industry for innovation in technology, industry 4. Again, I would like to quote an article of Bendoke recently, how digital monopolies have emerged. And while the innovation, while digital technologies have been shown as a hope for addressing many of the malaise, this has in fact become a major challenge. So what I would like to argue is that while we have articulated, we have been able to contribute enormously to the issue of innovation for inclusive development, and particularly in the global value chains, and able to integrate developing countries to integrate with the global economy with integrity. In the coming days, we have a lot more issues in the event of new challenges, particularly in the post-COVID world. And this is something that we have an enormous task of working among ourselves, sharing experience, and this should be forming a major work program for the GlobalX community in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, KJ, for that very stimulating picture and to start to look toward the future. I want to call everybody's attention to the very rich discussion that's developing in the chat. I don't want to distract you at all from our speakers, but there's really the questions that inclusive innovation connects to within innovation studies have several dimensions. The connection to catching up is out there, the connections to sustainability. It's really struck me through our 5 workshops how many of them have brought in issues of inclusion. This is not a sub area anymore. It's kind of a central connector for many, many different themes. And we have a little dialogue going on science diplomacy too. So we're turning next to Anne Kingiri, who's coming to us from Nairobi, from the African Center for Technology Studies. Anne, are you ready to go?
Yes, thank you so much, Susan. You can see my slides now?
We can, but you could go into slideshow mode. That would make it even better.
So, try to do that. So, you can see them now?
Yes. Thank you.
Great,
Beautiful.
thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much, Susan. Thank you so much, Judith and Joanna, for setting the scene concerning this particular topic that we are discussing today, quite important, particularly for the continent which I'm representing today. And I'm very much, glued to the conclusion that Joe, you raised in the concept of love, and how it relates to, the community and how we should promote what matters for social justice and inclusivity. I think that was quite interesting. Thank you. And for Judith, the aspect of social justice and innovation capability, and giving us the kind of like a history of where we are coming from as a community, the vision and agenda which has informed the work of the innovation and development community within Groberics. And they think the same vision which has shaped what has been happening within Africa, and particularly AfricaRICS. So it's very, very interesting to see what has been happening. And today, I want to share about this particular topic based on what we have been doing in AfricaRICS and my experience within ACTS, African Center for Technology Studies. This is my organization where I work, and basically based on my work focusing on gender and renewable energy, climate change, climate innovation, as well as recently I'm trying to look at how gender is playing out in the digital innovation. So I'm going to be looking at the innovation and development theme within AfricaRICS, and how inclusive innovation theme has been, fitting. How has it been evolving over the years? And this is based on some work that we've been doing. A paper is going to be coming out soon that is being led by a team from AfricaRICS, Erica and others, Becky McGrather and myself, that has managed to look at the various data sources that we have concerning this particular theme, innovation and development, and how it has been evolving over the years. And I've used this particular data to look at how the inclusive innovation topic and theme has been evolving over the years. And I will conclude on some thoughts about inclusive innovation framework and how it interrelates with my work that has been doing on gender studies in the context of Africa. For those who are aware, and many of them have seen them here joining us today, when AfricaRICS was launched in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania in 2012, there were quite a number of themes, 9 in number, which were perceived to be very, very critical in shaping the research agenda for Africa. And one of the themes was the role of gender in Africa's innovation system. But if you compare that particular theme over the years, and of course, between 2012 and where we are here, but also looking at quite a number of interesting data that we have on conference papers which were presented in Groberic conferences that were held in Africa, you are able to see that this particular thematic areas has been very, very, it has remained quite dominant, not so much pronounced like other thematic areas, but that this particular topic has been kind of taken into consideration over the years. So if you look at the papers that were presented during Groberic conferences that were held in Africa, as well as the AfricaRICS conferences, you can see this particular topic in relation to this particular case. The papers that we have looked at, the focus has been gender, much more on inclusive, as a theme, inclusivity as a theme, or inclusive innovation as a theme. So you can see how gender plays out in the continent. It plays out in different ways, and gender has been very predominant. The papers that have been presented for these particular conferences has been focusing on gender, and of course how gender plays out in different sectors. Very, very interesting observation we have seen. As we continue to look at the papers that have been presented over the years, before AfricaRICS, and this is Groberics conferences which were held in Africa, and AfricaRICS conferences, if you look at the papers, in terms of the theme, inclusive innovation theme and how it has been featuring over the years, the women in innovation system has actually remained predominant, not so much pronounced like other themes, agro-industry, work organization, low carbon, raw material costs, but it has over the years has been predominant. And if you can observe over the years in 2015, 2017, and 2018, there were quite a number of increased papers that were focusing on particularly women in innovation systems in different ways, but focusing on different sectoral areas. And I think this is something which can tell us a lot about how the inclusive innovation theme has been evolving in the continent. When we looked at the wording or the words, the mentioning of the words, we were keen to see the different wordings and how they were, how they were emerging in the papers. We were able to see a very interesting, dynamic around the sustainability and inclusion theme. It was emerging quite predominant compared to the other thematic areas. And what was interesting is that many of the papers that they could be focusing on other themes, but inside you could actually see that there was an element or aspect of inclusivity or sustainability, especially towards from the SDG, the period of SDG, the concept of sustainability has become quite pronounced. So over the years, in terms of Africa's research agenda, it has been changing. And this has actually been defined by the emerging dynamics, global dynamics relating to innovation and development. But what is important to note here that is the concept of inclusive innovation and development has remained important in the continent and focusing much more on issues of gender. Youth is becoming also quite pronounced. And recently we have seen people who are interested in persons with disability, quite interesting dynamics. Now I'm going to shift now into looking at this concept, inclusive innovation as an analytical framework, because it's now being used, in terms of how can we draw on the reach, where the origin, where it is coming from, and how we can draw on some of the concepts from innovation system thinking and in relation to inclusive innovation to inform the dynamics that you find within Africa. And I'm going to draw some thoughts based on what I said, the work I've been doing within my organization, although it has taken a policy focus in my analysis, but there are some thoughts that I can share here. Of course, they are subject to a discussion. And the question which I have been asking over the few years that I've been we're looking at this concept is, how appropriate is this concept in studying innovation, especially in the rural and informal setting in the global south? I would speak about Africa in this particular case. And what you see is about gender equality. The discussions, the narratives, sometimes they tend to focus much more on equality issues and towards social inclusivity and how this has been considered as a pathway to meeting the SDGs. But what I tend to see here in the narrative and the way this has been advanced is the lack of systemic approach on how this can be advanced in many sectors, particularly the sectors that I've been looking at. And then what I see is the lack of consideration of the innovation and recently transformative angle into gender research. And what you tend to see is the gender analysis towards gender mainstreaming, issues of incentivizing the disadvantaged groups to ensure that they participate or they're empowered, women, men, and other social groups, and how they fit in the innovation process. And then issues around, who is empowered and what is empowered and who is empowered if it is mainly women and youth in the case of Africa. and how they can empowering can achieve the desired SDGs. So the efforts to empower them, whether it is investments, different financing modules given to the women, targeting at women, promotion of investment among the youth, they just focus much more on how to empower them rather than how to gain understanding of sustainable empowerment as an aid in itself. And further work that we are doing recently on energy and gender, it tends to point towards, the focus on empowerment of women and youth, and the aspect of transformation, but forgetting that transformation, needs to be, analyzed or to be perceived in the context of the gender norms, transformative potential, and that has been lacking in much of the work that is going on around gender and energy. Then the other thing that I tend to see from my work has to do with how can we use this concept? How can it provide, insight into understanding and interrogating gender issues in relation to innovation? So there are quite a number of interesting, ideas that can come out of this, and which I'm going to be looking at in the next slide on how this concept can be explored. But I think what has been emerging more predominantly is around the need to test this concept in different contexts. The issue of methods and the metrics that can be applied to be able to understand much more on the dynamics that you find playing out, particularly at the micro level. The dynamics there, they're quite complex, and how we can use this particular concept to help us to understand that. So in terms of concluding, I would draw two main points and what we can draw from this concept, and which perhaps we can think about when we come to discussion. The need to shift from gender analysis towards gender mainstreaming, empowerment, among other things, towards gender learning. And here the key thing is gender learning, and giving more emphasis on learning as a way of changing, how things are done, among other things. And of course, gendering innovation process, the need to understand that we need to learn, how to do that, and also the context that actually shapes the learning process. And then the need to think about the frameworks, the approaches that have been used. I come across a lot of participatory action-oriented approaches that have been applied, particularly in agriculture innovation systems. And those frameworks are good. Actually, they can be a starting point for those people who want to integrate the research around gender and innovation. That can actually be a starting point, because there's a lot that we can draw from that and what has been happening over the years. A lot of work that has been done within the CGIARs focuses on gender, but much more on how we can make the gender groups more participatory, and how they can be empowered and all that. So they need to move that towards focusing on the quality of learning and how this can be enhanced to strengthen the capabilities for the different social groups. And the other concept that I would want us to reflect on has to do with how can we move from just women empowerment, and now we are talking of transformation, towards what I perceive to be much more important, systems empowerment. And that would help us to rethink the skills development which has been popularized, particularly when you are looking at the entrepreneurships or enterprises that are targeted at women and youth to enhance their skills towards economic development. How can we then rethink skills development, how we shape the strategies for skills development towards focusing on much more on innovation capabilities? And because if you focus on innovation capabilities, then you tend to go beyond just the skills, focus on the skills and action of individuals to actually encompass the needs of the system. and how you can, enhance the capabilities at the system level. And if you do that, then you are able to capture some of the policy and institutional dynamics that are more complex, and they influence the functioning of the system. I think I'm going to stop there for now, and then we can come back to, to the same discussion at some point. I'm sure there will be some interest in some of these thoughts, and there will probably be, somebody would want to add value or probably to seek clarification. Back to you, Susan. Thank you.
Indeed, lots of interest in this, and thank you. That was such an interesting new set of angles to bring in, because some of us have felt that gender has been a little neglected. I'm so glad to see your data that it has not been, particularly in the African context, and particularly, I think, because of your leadership on it. So we're going to turn now to our final discussant in this section, Jeffrey Orozco, and just to let Thomas in the next segment know, unfortunately, Glenda Cruz has had to leave us because of some emerging health issues. And so we've got a few extra minutes left. So Jeffrey Orozco from the National University in Costa Rica, also a former Secretary General of Globalix, and somebody who has brought a very rural-based perspective into these issues of inclusion for a while. Jeffrey, please go right ahead. Thank you for having your slides up while I get you pinned.
Okay, thank you, Susan, and a very good workshop, very good presentations, and I'm very happy to be part of this community. I have very general comments and some reflections at the end of the possible agenda. I think all Judith and Joanne and also Anne and KJ make a lot of statements of general issues we have been researching in Globalix. And I think from developing countries, it's very important, the application part of policies. So I have some reflections on how this can be oriented for policies at the end, and what kind of policy could be useful. And then I will present some examples in Costa Rica. So the first, I think, is very clear for everybody that innovation is not a goal itself. It might be seen as a tool to reach some objectives in the society. But the problem is that the actors developing innovation are not most of the time thinking in their own goals and objectives, and not in global goals. So the sum of individual efforts doesn't not necessarily lead to collective well-being. And this is the problem then with concentration on income and destruction of the environment and other several problems. Because of that, it's necessary some orientation of the innovation effort using policy, regulation, incentives, etc. And this is the case thinking about inclusive growth. So the point here is that we need this kind of intervention to orient the innovations towards the inclusive growth or inclusive development. Some examples in Costa Rica, so to be very short, we have had some examples oriented with explicit policies, but developing from the participation of many actors, and in the cooperative, in the agricultural sector, are good examples. Giving access to the state-of-the-art technology of the producers, and it's not the case in sector without cooperatives. So it's not easy to reach the technologies. In the cooperative is easier. Value added and access to profits from industrialization of it. And I think this is very important also, because the the producers can get better income when they get a part of the value added from the industrialization part. The technological transfer and that this also is part of developing of capabilities in general. It's not just giving equipment, it's all the capabilities developing in different programs. And then this is part of the program is the advice that the cooperative give to the producers and the funding of and credits to get access to these technologies, equipment, etc. I think it's a good example in many sectors, in many products in the agricultural sectors. And I think the problem now is that it's not that easy in the political context, in the actual political context, to promote new cooperatives. There are some limitations, of course, in this kind of models. It's very positive, the role of cooperative, because of all these possibilities and benefits I mentioned. But the problem is that not everybody can enter to the cooperatives, and especially, for example, in Costa Rica, in the dairy sector, is very strong cooperative and very powerful one, but now it's close to new producers. So the people out of the cooperative, they don't get the access to all the benefits the cooperative gives. So from the point of view of inclusive growth, is a clear limitation. So being in the primary production league without being part of the cooperative or similar organization that process and commercialize the production, it generates a series of barriers of the type of innovation that the primary producer can drive. And it's very difficult to think in developing new cooperative competing with the previous ones. So it's just a limitation. Another example in Costa Rica, I think, is in applied actions, really actions for trying to promote inclusive growth, is the role of universities. Universities also supporting the producers in the agricultural sector and in other sectors. And it has been very important, the role, through its activities of contribution to the society and social action. Their support has motivated linkages of the subsector to the national innovation systems. The collaboration have been focused in three priority areas: information and training, technical assistance and support in organization change, acquisition of technology. And I think these areas of action have been really relevant for inclusive growth in many sectors, especially in the agricultural sector. There are other kind of sectoral organizations also giving for the development of policies. It's all the part of negotiations also, R&D, technological transfer, genetic improvement, nutritional improvement, pasture of other products management, adaptation to climate change, etc. But this kind of sectoral organization have been very relevant also for inclusive growth because of the role in the dialogue and negotiation process of policies. And I think it's part of, at the end, I will finish with a reflection on that. But we have in the actual context a lot of challenges. First, that free trade agreements everywhere, and in Costa Rica we have agreement with almost everybody. From the point of view of inclusive growth, it is clear that the small producers face great challenges in order to remain competitive within a market that is increasingly exposed to international competition. The challenge is also for the cooperative and the state entities. They should reinforce the research and development schemes as well as the mechanisms of technology transfer. But it's not difficult in the political context because the budget is limited in a lot of cases. The panorama of income concentration in few hands is not the best for a natural orientation toward inclusive growth. And I think at national level is the same. It's not easy to promote some kind of policy with this social view. In addition, the political situation in many countries and in the international level is not the best for inclusive growth, and it is clear. We need, I think this is the last reflection in the end, that we maybe in Globalics have been working a lot in the analysis of policies, but I think maybe a lot of concentration in the part of design and policy statements in some way. But I think in developing countries, it's very important the implementation part of policy. So it's another big challenge, because in developed countries, there is a institutional infrastructure that is good to apply the policies. So the problem is not just designing policies and the negotiation part with the different actors, because the infrastructure, institutional infrastructure, give the possibility to apply these policies. But in developing countries, sometimes we have good design of policies, but very poor capabilities to apply it. And I think we need also in Globalics to research about that and to give some orientation also in the general agenda in this way, implementation and development of capabilities and capacities of the different actors to apply the policies. And this is my final reflection. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Boy, that's given us a very concrete sense of the institutions out there, the potential on the positive side, and the challenges on that implementation side. At this point, we actually need to move on to our second segment, but I want to thank all the speakers from this segment, this initial kind of looking back at what we've contributed as Globalics, for really creating a great framework for the discussion. And I want to urge everybody to continue. We've got a lot of really nice questions in the chat, and to continue some of the discussion there. For instance, Judith, you've been a big critic of the catching up concept. Maybe you want to go out and add some thoughts on that. And on sustainability, maybe in the chat as we move on. I'm going to turn over now to Thomas Woodson from the State University of New York at Stony Brook to chair the next session, to be the facilitator, and he can introduce the speakers there. But I want to introduce Thomas a bit. He's one of the members of our interim board for the North American Network on Learning, Innovation, and Competence Building Systems. You haven't seen a lot of North Americans out here over the years in the Globalics community, but Thomas has been one of them, and you will be seeing more of us as NACLIX moves forward. So Thomas, over to you.